Okay, now we're recording, and it seems like a good time to begin.
You know how to do this?
And I just invite anyone who is in the audience, if you're not sort of actively speaking or asking a question, just go ahead and put yourself on mute, because that'll make it easier for us to make sure that everyone can be heard. So now to begin. Greetings, Melvillians. I'm Brian Yothers, chair of the English department at the University of Texas at El Paso and editor of Leviathan, a journal of Melville studies. I'm pleased to welcome you to this virtual session for the 2021 American Literature Association, Melville's Anatomies 2 Decades Later. We'll spend the first half of our roundtable hearing from our panelists, and then we will proceed to a wider discussion that will hopefully include many of you who are on this call. I want to remind everyone that we will be recording this session, in fact, are right now, and I'd like to ask that we all keep our microphones on mute except when we're actually speaking. Thanks again for joining us. Because of the fact that this recording is taking place in El Paso, Texas, at least I'm sitting in El Paso, Texas right now, where the high is going to be 108 degrees. I'm sad to say, so you can all be glad that you're somewhere else other than where I am. I'm going to go ahead and begin with the landed acknowledgement statement from UTEP's College of Liberal Arts, since this seems to be as much a place that we're meeting as anywhere. So here is the statement. As members of the University of Texas at El Paso community, we acknowledge that we are meeting on unceded indigenous land. We would like to recognize and pay our respects to the indigenous people with long ties to the immediate region. Lipan Apache, Mescalero Apache, Piro, Manso, Suma, Jumano, Isleta del Sur Pueblo, Piro, Manso, Tiwa Indian tribe of the Pueblo of San Juan de Guadalupe, and Tortugas Pueblo. We also acknowledge the nations whose territories include present-day Texas, the Carrizo and Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Caddo, Tonkawa, Comanche, Alabama, Coushatta, Kickapoo, and the peoples of Chihuahua and northern Mexico, from whom many of our students descend, such as the Raramuri, Tapahuan, Wixárika, and Tlata peoples. Finally, we recognize all of the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories here in Paso del Norte on Turtle Island. The University of Texas at El Paso honors your history and cultures, and we seek greater awareness of the myriad ways in which your legacy can guide us in fruitful partnerships and mutually fulfilling relationships. Okay, so to introduce our roundtable, our long deferred roundtable. To read Melville closely is to read widely and deeply. Samuel Otter explained in the opening of his 1999 study, Melville's Anatomies. And it is hard to think of a work of Melville scholarship that illustrates this point more powerfully than Melville's Anatomies itself, a defining text in Melville studies at the turn of the 21st century, and an exemplary study for Melville scholars more than 20 years on. The first time I read Melville's Anatomies, I was in the middle of my own study of the history of Melville scholarship, and even as I'd been reading many bold and inventive studies of Melville's work over the better part of a century since the Melville revival, I know that I'd never encountered anything quite like this book. Rereading it in preparation for this panel, I'm again struck by the way in which wit and profundity interact throughout in a way that can only be described as truly Melvillian. The fact that the first chapter has as its title, Losing Face in Taipei, effortlessly punning on the roles that cannibalism, tattooing, and racialization play throughout Melville's first book, sets the stage for the subtle explorations of aesthetics, culture, race, and ideology that follow. Crucially, Melville's Anatomies always refuses false dichotomies. Melville comes off as neither a hero nor a villain, neither as a prophetic ironist innocent of his society's racial biases, nor as a particularly eloquent mouthpiece for those biases, but rather as a writer who consistently identifies the moral and artistic stakes for his own time and for ours in the conceptual understandings of the racial and gendered body in the 19th century. Exploring Melville's novels from Typee to Pierre, Otter identified what were to be defining features of Melville criticism in the new century: race, sexuality, and the body, the relationship between the human and non-human world, visual aesthetics, and a blend of rigorous close reading and deep cultural immersion in considering Melville's life and work. That Otter read widely as well as deeply in writing this book is captured by the fact that it's possible to gain new insight into Emily Dickinson from an aside in Otter's discussion of Samuel Morden's craniometrical investigations, or into Poe's Berenice or Hawthorne's The Birthmark through his consideration of how the body becomes charged with meaning in the wider field of 19th century literary studies, offering the elegant formulation that, quote, the search for signs of grace has become inflected by the quest for signs of race. Still more, although this book is titled Melville's Anatomies and not Douglas's Anatomies or Apus's Anatomies, one could do far worse in introducing the reflections of Frederick Douglass and William Apus on race, racism, and corporeality than providing one's students with the relevant pages from this book. As crucial as political and cultural questions are to the argument, the book also provides a remarkably patient and thoughtful tour of visual culture writ large in the 19th century United States, from usual suspects like Thomas Cole to more improbable reflections on the odd beauty of the illustrations of skulls in Morden's Crania Americana. There's much more I could say, but I'll stop here to avoid preempting the observations by our distinguished roundtable of panelists. This roundtable, initially planned for the 2020 ALA conference, celebrates somewhat belatedly the 20th anniversary of this milestone in Melville's studies. And I'm going to hold it up so that we can see the material book in front of us as we begin, which has done so much to shape the scholarship that has followed it. I will briefly introduce each of our roundtable participants directly before they speak. They've provided a richly complementary set of reflections on Otter's contributions to Melville scholarship and Melville's Anatomies, and we very much look forward to hearing from all of them and of course from Sam Otter himself. Our first speaker is Wynn Kelly, who will discuss Samuel Otter's style and is senior lecturer in literature at MIT and author of Melville's City, Literary and Urban Form in 19th Century New York from 1996, and of Herman Melville, An Introduction from 2008. She's co-author with Henry Jenkins of Reading in a Participatory Culture, 2013. She's a former associate editor of Leviathan and editor of the Blackwell Companion to Herman Melville from 2006. She's also co-edited with Christopher Ogg, the new companion to Herman Melville. She's the associate director of the Melville Electronic Library, and she also works with MIT's Digital Humanities Lab on digital pedagogy and serves in the Melville Society Cultural Project, which oversees a scholarly archive at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Welcome, Wynn.
Thank you, Brian. I'll share my screen. Okay, I cannot do justice to Samuel Otter's style in Melville's, what are they? Anatomies. And in any case, I am more interested in how it works, particularly in relation to irony. The irony of Otter's refusal of what he calls, quote, the comforts of irony, unquote, a position that seems even more crucial in 2021 than it did in 1999. Otter employs irony, not, quote, as a sign of critical distance, the space between the self who observes and the self who performs feeling, unquote, but as instead acknowledging the unbearable spectacle of bodies, suffering, violated, excessive, bodies indelibly marked by differences of race and species, bodies from which ironic distance cannot exempt a complicit observer. Returning to his book recently, I saw the necessity of refusing ironic distance as he reads through 19th century discourses of racial science, anatomy, and difference. Whoops, I jumped ahead. His irony is enmeshed in pain, distress, and revulsion. In his chapter on type P, for example, quote, "The gut fear is not that the insides will be torn out and the flesh devoured. Rather, it is that the insides will be made visible and vulnerable on the surface of the body and that the flesh will be inscribed in type E. To be eaten would be a relief." From a chapter on Moby Dick, quote, "If it seems peculiar to juxtapose Walt Whitman and Samuel George Morton, the singer of the body electric and the quantifier of crania, it may be because I have not yet begun to give you a full account of Crania Americana." Brian was referring to this passage earlier. It is one of the most beautiful books published in the United States in the first half of the 19th century. And then in this reading of Pierre's writing himself into a book, "For the ink to lie thick, the blood must be thinned." The wit is amusing, the critical voice is urbane, but the subject and Otter's proximity to it is terrifying. In a recent chapter by Jeffrey Sanborn on Moby Dick, he recommends what he calls an immersive experience of Moby Dick, surrendering to the rhythms and swells of sentences that, as we see here and in Otter's work as well, quote, "do not read like the after the fact constructions. They read instead like high intensity efforts to keep up with the unfolding of the scenes in his imagination. Such rolling sentences do not, as one might think," here's some examples of Melville sentences, "undo critical or judgment or thought. Rather, they put one in the frame of mind to think better, especially about the kinds of issues and histories Samuel Otter is talking about." What? Sorry. Because it, Moby Dick, is so attuned and receptive to unconscious activities, and because its cast of characters is so racially diverse, it provides us with an especially rich opportunity to think through the complex relationship between race, racism, and the unconscious. For Sanborn, and as we see in Melville's Anatomies, aesthetic and effective responses do not undo critique, but instead soften the bias that prevents creative thought. Otter's writing too thinks through complex relationships, bursting the shackles of custom and decorum. For example, this paragraph from chapter 4 delivers the sort of rolling swells that Sanborn is talking about, but also a few punches. Quote, "When Pierre observes the atmospheric effects in Lucy's eyes, he cannot contain himself. More precise, he cannot contain his eyes. Or to be even more precise, his eyes cannot contain their pupils." In this treatment of Melville's style, Sam Otter reveals hallmarks of his own. The rising energy of clauses in the opening sentence that respond to, but also frame a similar rising action in Melville's. An anatomy of perception itself as its excesses become disturbing. Finally, a lovely play on extremes taken to their extremity, even as they fold into the contours of a map that is both sublime and ambivalent. I can think of no better way to begin talking today about a book that thinks and feels with its subject as it travels through terrifying terrain. And I will venture a conclusion, or maybe a starting point. Right now, we need Samuel Otter's, quote, "blinding fulfillment of the picturesque goal of feeling through the eyes." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wynn. And I think this was a great way to start our discussion. The additional papers, the next 4, will each be dealing with one section of Melville's Anatomies, but Wynn starts us off nicely with a kind of bracing overview of the volume as a whole. So our second speaker is going to be Cody Mars, who will discuss the introduction and the chapter on Moby Dick. Cody is professor of English at the University of Georgia. He is the author of Not Even Past, The Stories We Keep Telling About the Civil War and 19th Century American Literature and the Long Civil War, the editor of the new Melville Studies, the co-editor of Timelines of American Literature, and the general editor of 19th Century American Literature in Transition, a series forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. His work has also appeared in journals such as American Literature, American Literary History, and I'm very happy to say in Leviathan. Welcome, Cody.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks everyone else for joining us here today. So I'm delighted to talk with you, albeit virtually, and have this discussion about Melville's Anatomies. Part of my enthusiasm has to do with the relative scarcity of such roundtables. How often do we get to talk, I mean really talk, about scholarly books that were published decades ago? But my interest is also personal, because Melville's Anatomies has shaped my understanding of Melville, as well as American literary studies more generally, in more ways than I can describe. I've read the book 3 times now, first as a graduate student, then as an assistant professor writing my own first book and looking for a great example, and most recently this summer. When I read Melville's Anatomies now, I'm struck in particular by 2 things, 2 indelible qualities of the book as both an intellectual project and as a case study in scholarly writing. The first thing is its openness. By openness, I mean what Sam does with the interpretive points that unfold over the course of the book. The way Melville's Anatomies models its subject by refusing to provide neat, tidy answers to messy questions about race, embodiment, and knowledge. There is, of course, a central point around which the book revolves, an argument about Melville's corporeal obsessions and the way those obsessions mediate and inform Melville's ideological engagements. But that argument behaves like figurative language in Melville's writing, spinning off into surprising associations and interesting paradoxes. To offer just one example, about halfway through the book, Sam reflects on Ishmael's relationship with Queequeg, a boundary-breaking relationship, if ever there was one, that progresses from fear to love in a way that subverts cultural expectations. In Moby Dick, he writes, touch transforms not only character relations, but also racial diction and syntax. After feeling Queequeg, there's no more talk of mildewed skulls, abominable savages, and checkered skin. Judgments of character, and again, this is Sam writing, are made on the basis of behavior and bearing, and not according to permanent types. Superior features are not racially ascribed, but instead dispersed indiscriminately among Polynesian and American royalty. In Melville's transformational grammar, neither adjectives nor nouns embody permanent qualities. It's an insightful point. And in the hands of another scholar, this would present an ideal opportunity to pivot away from the text and comment more generally on Melville's politics or draw a conclusion about Melville's views on race. Yet in Melville's Anatomies, such conclusions are only tentative at best, precisely because of Melville's complicated treatment of language and his awareness of the provisionality of knowledge. Almost immediately, Sam turns the analysis back around, spotlighting what remains unresolved and unanswered. The clear reversals and displacements, he points out, are complicated in the narrative, which begins rather than ends with images of interracial homosexual marriage and the jumbling of racial syntax. The trajectory of the novel undercuts the desire to see Ishmael's transformation as permanent. And even Ishmael's initial efforts to stand inside Queequeg's skin end in estrangement, he observes. Melville's Anatomies is full of these types of subtle, contingent, maybe I should say Melvillian interpretations, all of which underscore a point that Sam makes early on. Quote, Melville offers neither a transcendent critique nor a symptomatic recapitulation, but an inside sense of the power of ideology, its satisfactions, and its incarcerations. That lesson continues to be relevant for the field, and it's one of the reasons why Melville's Anatomies both informs and influences scholarship to this day. The book helps us understand the verbal, philosophical, and aesthetic complexity of Melville's writing from the inside out, apprehending it in terms of what Sam dubs its intimate excess. In rereading the book this summer, I was also struck by the entanglement of the verbal and the visual in Melville's writing as well as in Sam's. Each chapter centers on a stunning image or visual scene, from the tattooing in chapter 1 to the floggings in chapter 2, the art and science of skulls in chapter 3, and the landscapes in chapter 4. The book reveals a great deal not only about the ways in which ideology is embodied and envisioned, but also about the ways in which Melville's writing joins what is seen and what is heard, attuning us to the phenomenology of perception and to language's ineluctable entanglement with art. Think of the manner in which chapter 3 flows across cranial forms, both real and imagined, from Morton's skulls to Renaissance paintings to Ishmael's cetologies. Toward the end of that chapter, Sam reflects on Melville's fascination with the visual, pointing out the, quote, elaborate choreography of balked access in the last section of Moby Dick, when Ahab finds no image in the vacant pupils of Pip's eyes, is locked in fixed gazes with Fedallah, sees the magic glass of human comfort in Starbuck's eye, but averts his sight, and then finds that Starbuck has fled and that he's looking into the reflection of Fedallah's eyes, and finally, fatally, sees Moby Dick. We might frame this relationship as a kind of ecosystem, a network of relations between the verbal and the visual that Sam carefully and cogently explores throughout Melville's Anatomies. In that regard, the book resembles the image with which it begins, Mark Milhoff's painting, Queequeg Rescues Tashtego. Quote, and this is Sam writing about Milhoff, but the same could be said of Sam as a writer and a critic. Quote, with a keen eye and ear, he conveys the bold gestures toward the reader, the corporeal immersions, the visceral, viscous desires, the strange incorporations and animations, the twisting of lines and turning of tropes, and the piercing, unsettling scrutiny. Like Melville's prose and Milhoff's art, Sam's book is a quest for depth through overwrought surface. If Melville was one of those rare writers who is both part and not part of his era, the same can be said of the best Melville scholarship, which partakes in the trends of its time, but isn't entirely defined by it. There are classic books on Melville written generations ago that deserve and reward rereading, no matter when they were published, because they tell us something true and significant about Melville's craft and Melville's world. In my opinion, Melville's Anatomies belongs on our bookshelves alongside those other classic works of scholarship. So I wouldn't be surprised if, years down the road, there are more roundtables like this one at moments far removed from our own, Melville's Anatomies at 30 or 40 perhaps. With any luck, I'll see you there.
Thank you so much, Cody. So our third speaker is Mary Kay Bercaw Edwards, who will discuss the Type P chapter. And she is Associate Professor of English and Director of Maritime Studies at the University of Connecticut. She is a former president of the Melville Society, and she now serves as extracts editor for Leviathan. She is the author of Melville's Sources from 1987, Cannibal Old Me, Spoken Sources in Melville's Early Works from 2009, and most recently, Sailor Talk, Labor, Utterance, and Meaning in the works of Melville, Conrad, and London from just this past year. And she is co-editor of Wilson Heflin's Herman Melville's Whaling Years, 2004. A Coast Guard licensed captain, she has 58,000 miles at sea, all under sail. Welcome, Mary Kay.
Thank you, Brian. So I'm going to start with a quote from Melville's Anatomies. The deepest horror in Type E is maiming the body by writing upon it, not the severed head upon a pike, but the head still attached to the body, the face and skull punctuated with conspicuous lines of difference for all to read. As Sam Otter argues in Melville's Anatomies, it is Tomo's fear of being tattooed that drives him from the Type E Valley far more than his fear of being eaten. At first glance, Melville's Type E may appear to be one of many 19th century narratives of South Pacific cannibalism, such as George H. von Langsdorff's Voyages and Travels in the Various Parts of the World, 1813. Langsdorff was a German naturalist and explorer who served as a naturalist and physician on the first Russian circumnavigation from 1803 to 1805. Yet, as Sam notes, the emphasis on cannibalism at the end of Type E diverts attention from the deeper threat, that of the facial and racial vulnerability revealed in the scene of tattooing. Melville's early works are permeated with a deep-seated abhorrence of any indelible marking of what Sam calls the immaculateness of human flesh, of the human body. This abhorrence is manifest in Melville's discussion of tattooing in Type E, of flogging in White Jacket, of Ahab's scar and missing leg in Moby Dick, but most obviously in the quote, feeling akin to horror with which the sailors look at Lem Hardy in chapter 7 of Omu, quote, a stranger, a renegade from Christendom and humanity, who had allowed himself to be tattooed with a blue band stretching across his face and a blue shark on his forehead. Lem Hardy is a renegade from humanity. He has forfeited his human identity. As Tomo in Type E apprehends, tattooing forever marks a human. Marquesan tattooing covered much of the body, blacking it and turning the skin a greenish tint with time. If Tomo had allowed Karki to tattoo him, his identity would be forever altered, from sailor to irreclaimable outsider, in essence to a creature without humanity. When Tomo first meets Mehevi, the principal chief of the Types, Mehevi has a, quote, rigidity of aspect under which I absolutely quailed. Mehevi assumes this impenetrable mask-like countenance, what Tomo calls that peculiarly stern expression whenever he is angry. He is so angry with Tomo near the end of the book that he essentially transmutes into Mau Mau, a character who does not appear until chapter 32. Mau Mau is the most ferocious of the Types, one who indulges offstage in a cannibalistic feast. Not only does he have only one eye, but his face is also hideously tattooed, and his cheek has been pierced by a spear. Tomo first feels his presence before he sees him. Tomo is being pressed backwards, quote, when I felt a heavy hand laid upon my shoulder and turning round encountered the bulky form of Mau Mau, a one-eyed chief who had just detached himself from the crowd below. Mau Mau appears first as a specter, a felt presence before Tomo is confronted with the shock of his deformed and tattooed face, as repellent to Tomo as Freddy Krueger's burned face in the horror film A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. In contrast to such horror, Langsdorff brings a jocular tone to his description of Marquesan cannibalism that Melville at times mimics in Type E. Langsdorff tells us that we are, quote, indebted to cannibal nations for the information that white men are finer flavored than Negroes and that Englishmen are preferable to Frenchmen. Finally, they tell us that the inside of the hand and sole of the foot are the nicest parts of the human body. Langsdorff's discussion of cannibalism is not drenched in horror, but in a macabre jocularity that veers into the absurd. Melville achieves the same tone when he has the sailor Ned tell Tomo that the Types don't like sailors' flesh, it's too salt. Yet such lightheartedness and jocularity is missing from Melville's mentions of tattooing. Sam argues at the core of Tomo's bare thought is the fear of being covered, of being rendered hideous for life by indelible and invidious marks, the stark fear of having his bare skin written upon for all to read. The indelibility of tattooing and the fact that one is then marked for life have been commented on by other scholars, but Sam furthers this observation with an investigation into the ties between Type E and other Western narratives of voyaging to the Marquesas and the, quote, American science of ethnology. As Sam observes, although the markings on Marquesan faces are permanent, they are not consistent from face to face. He continues, the ethnological guarantee that the individual recapitulates the race is invalidated. Marquesan faces offer the horrifying prospect of indelibility and insecurity. In Type E, Sam writes, the deep marks are cut by the instruments of the tattoo artist and by the invisible pencil of the ethnologist. In the shift from anthropophagy to tattooing, from the contents of the body being devoured to the character of the individual being made visible in the skin, the risk becomes deeper rather than superficial. Confined in the skin, identity becomes more vulnerable. With a nod to Montaigne's 1580 essay, Type E begins as Melville's of cannibalism and ends as his of tattooing. Moby Dick concludes powerfully with the word orphan. With a similar rhetorical power, Losing Face, the Type E chapter of Melville's Anatomies, concludes with the word tattoo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Kay. Now we move to our fourth speaker, and I'll just point out that his 2-volume biography of Melville is located just over my shoulder as I'm sitting here in El Paso. Our fourth speaker is John Bryant, who will discuss the White Jacket chapter, and he is Professor Emeritus of English at Hofstra University. He has published 15 books, print and digital editions, and over 70 articles on Melville, 19th century American literature and culture, scholarly editing, biography, and digital scholarship. His critical and theoretical works include Melville and Repose, The Rhetoric of Humor in the American Renaissance, and The Fluid Text, A Theory of Revision and Editing for Book and Screen. His book, Melville Unfolding, Sexuality, Politics, and the Versions of Typee, draws upon his online fluid text edition titled Herman Melville's Typee, appearing in the Rotunda Electronic Imprint, University of Virginia Press, 2006, which was the second electronic edition to be awarded the MLA at CSE Seal of Approval. The former editor of the Melville Society, he created and edited Leviathan, a journal of Melville studies, which was designated CELJ's Best New Journal of 2000. He is, of course, the editor of the Melville Electronic Library, and very recently, the author of the magnificent 2-volume biography of Melville's early life that you can see over my shoulder. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Brian. Would that everyone had my book over your shoulder, or his or her shoulder. But and if I suddenly go blank, it's because I'm in Chicago, and there is an incredible electric storm that's just about to hit. So let's see if we can make it through. On occasions such as this, we gather to celebrate not only the impact of a book, but also its author. And of course, our profession being populated with open-hearted practitioners of the critical arts, we largely caring, friendly, and generous people, not ever given to noisome sarcasms, ironies, and the japing of colleagues. And yet, we nevertheless anticipate that our celebrations will take the form of a bit of ribbing, and yet Sam Otter is himself so bright and giving as a thinker, writer, editor, and teacher, so distinctive in his command of literature, America's cultures, and the fine arts, so generous in his own presentation of self as to invite others to grow in emulation of him, that one is hard-pressed exactly how to make fun of him. Therefore, I have decided not to begin with any japing at all. I have decided that it is something I oughter not do. Oh, okay, sorry. Rather, I want to begin with what any book about American literatures and cultures can do. Apart from the larger agenda of opening us to hemispheric and world literatures and cultures, such a study should have a vision of larger concern, either explicitly announced or implied, that addresses problems of human experience. It should introduce, explain, and model for us a critical vocabulary that enables our deeper understanding of how a democratic culture works or doesn't work. It should enliven our sense of the interactions of ideology, experience, and art in ways that encourage new ways of close reading. It should be the kind of historicism that finds patterns in past behaviors and shows how they are replayed textually in multiple versions, in genres, arguments, symbols. It should watch for evolutions in a writer's work. And above all, it should speak to us in a voice that balances insight, urgency, style, and self-awareness. If lucky, such a critical study will remain insightful, urgent, and self-aware 20 years beyond its date of publication. And there are many ways to pull together these ambitions for an excellent critical study of literature and culture into a book. And Melville's Anatomies is effective on all counts. Sam's chapter on White Jacket is particularly compelling. Ostensibly, it continues Book's pursuit of the anatomy as a genre that, quote, diagnoses social conditions by figuring the political state as a physical body. Otter shows that this genre is shared by, quote, reformers, radicals, and reactionaries, as diverse as Black abolitionists like Douglas, Solomon Northrop, and James Pennington, and white sailors such as Samuel Leach, William McNally, Richard Henry Dana, and of course, Herman Melville. Otter's version of the anatomy in White Jacket is comprehensive, not reductive, in integrating social and artistic conceptions of the racialized body in antebellum culture. Its rhetorical forms, tropes, and symbols, including the slave narrative and the seaman's narrative, flogging as a scene of social hierarchy and identity formation, the paradox of object-subject positionality, and the aspiration of transracial consciousness. But in Otter's deployment of the anatomy, the state is not only figured as a body, but the body is also the sharper and material manifestation of consciousness. Thus, Sam's method directs us to the anxieties of racial identity, as well as what he calls, quote, corporeal anxieties in the analogy between sailor and slave. In this regard, emotion and thought are treated not as a mental abstraction, but somatically and rooted in the physical. This corporeal anxiety gets to the heart of Melville's aesthetic. As Ahab puts it, contemplating the conversion of Ahab's coffin into a lifebuoy, quote, oh, how immaterial are all materials. What things real are there but imponderable thoughts? Otter helps us see that with Melville, body and thought are inseparable dyad, whose porous border is skin. But let's put aside this trope of skin for the time being, for it returns in Otter's reading of White Jacket's symbolic White Jacket. Otter begins not with the material immateriality of skin, but by analyzing a form of argumentation inflected by the ideologies of race and made evident in various scenes of flogging. That argument Otter calls, quote, the slave analogy. An oversimplification would be that because white sailors and Black slaves share flogging in common, their analogous abuse can be used differently. White supremacists like McNally use the analogy to argue that flogging degrades white sailors as we would Black slaves, and to restore sailors to their superior status. And yet at the same time, the slave analogy is a rhetorical mechanism for instilling a deeper empathy among whites for Black abuse. Sam's treatment of Dana's scene of flogging is memorable. Two white sailors, an immigrant Swede and a US Southerner, who has formerly regaled his mates with the, quote, queer Negro stories of his native state, that's Melville, quote, are both flogged. The Swede's reaction is anger, and his subsequent life is animated by plotting revenge. But the Southerner succumbs to, quote, a feeling of degradation and, quote, loses all life and elasticity. He will have nothing to do with the Swede's plots. Dana only implies a meaning that Otter deftly reveals. The Southerner has, quote, felt the class difference between himself. And this abusive social superior, not in his heart or soul, but at the level of skin. Quote, the failure of the Southerner's white skin precipitates an inner collapse. He, quote, feels the force of the analogy between sailor and slave, and that force breaks him. He is, as Melville puts it in Typee, unmanned. Or as Ishmael in a different book asks rhetorically and comically, who ain't a slave? You'll note the turn from the rhetoric of the slave analogy to the materiality of skin. This inevitable presence of skin animates Otter's argumentation. It is violated by whips. It is, in Sam's apt phrasing that recalls Tomo's ambivalence over tattooing in Typee, quote, a pierced identity. But before I conclude with the marvel of Sam's conversion of skin into jacket, which is what we eventually discover is the whole point of this jewel of a chapter on Whitejacket, I'd like to share my immediate thought concerning Sam's reading of the Swede and the Southerner. There was for me a momentary Trumpian analogy in Sam's working through of the slave analogy. Is there not, in the Southerner's sense of degradation, a hint of whatever it must be that compels the hatred in the post-bellum American version of white supremacy? Some perceived degradation, some failure of the skin, some loss of elasticity, a rigidity of hatred too deep to call mere prejudice, but a resentment waiting to be channeled into violence. Whether or not Dana's flogged Southerner is a precursor of the lost cause mentality or a version of today's January 6th insurrectionist, the unanticipated application of Otter's treatment of the slave analogy that I felt is that feelings of white degradation persist, and demagogues will continue to exploit it until we more fully anatomize and pierce through our culture's anxiety of skin. We will not begin to comprehend the racialized deformations of democratic consciousness we continue to experience. As Otter puts it, writers like Dana and Melville help us, quote, inhabit the position of the oppressed in whatever modality oppression is perceived to be. This Melvillian idea that the immaterial consciousness is informed by its relation to the material body, by the materiality of our skins, is not fatalistic or predeterminate of the conduct of our lives in society, at least not so in Whitejacket. There is, as Otter reminds us in the full title of his chapter and in the consummation of that chapter, the ability to, quote, jump out of one's skin. Melville achieves this jumping out of his skin through writing, and his alter ego, Whitejacket, does this too, literally, when this all-absorbing coat encumbers him up in the rigging and sucks him down beneath the sea, and he cuts himself out of it. But this final act occurs only because Melville has transformed the material jacket into an immaterial symbol of a self he needs to grow out of. Otter puts it directly, the jacket is skin. It is this textual version of a material thing of embodied consciousness. As Whitejacket puts it, quote, there are no mysteries out of ourselves. And as Sam Otter concludes, there are no mysteries out of ourselves because in Melville's anatomy of antebellum racial discourse, the deepest mysteries lie within ourselves, waiting, longing to be read on the surface of our bodies, end quote. Good writing, Sam, and thank you for it.
Thank you so much, John. So our fifth speaker today is going to be Bob Levine. Robert S. Levine, who will discuss the Pierre chapters, is Distinguished University Professor of English at the University of Maryland. His most recent books are Race, Transnationalism, and 19th Century American Literary Studies, which was published by Cambridge in 2018, and The Failed Promise, Reconstruction, Frederick Douglass, and the Impeachment of Andrew Johnson, which will be published by W.W. Norton this summer, and which I predict will soon have a spot on my shelf as well. He is the general editor of the Norton Anthology of American Literature, the new 10th edition of which will appear in late 2021. In 2008, he co-edited with Sam Otter, Frederick Douglass, and Herman Melville, Essays in Relation, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press. Welcome, Bob.
Okay, thank you, Brian. And thanks all of you for being here. One thing I want to assure you is my room is super bright. I could be wearing sunglasses. I have an old computer and somehow it has me in the shadows. So it's an honor to be participating in this homage to Sam Otter's Melville's Anatomies. And there are three quick things I want to say before moving to my main focus on Pierre. First, how many books have two-word titles and no subtitle? That short, bold title speaks to the confidence and boldness of Sam's vision. Second, like many on this panel, I've always been struck by the book's beautiful prose style and its attention to close reading. I'm not sure that I know what surface reading is, which is an approach developed post Melville's Anatomies by one of Sam's colleagues at Berkeley, but it seems to me that it should be something like what Sam does in Melville's Anatomies. Third, I want to praise the book in the context of its time and place, Berkeley, as a historicist book that's not new historical. At the time when Sam came up for tenure, Berkeley was the high church of new historicism. Sam reads Melville's writings in relation to other discourses of the time. That is what new historicists were doing, but he resists the reductive endpoint of Foucauldian incarceration. He presents Melville as acknowledging the appeal of discourses and probing them with an interest in both what Sam calls, and now I'm quoting both Sam and Cody, who also touched on this passage, their satisfactions and incarcerations. That emphasis on satisfactions would have separated Sam from a number of his colleagues voting on his tenure. This was a brave book in that regard. To turn to Pierre, I have to confess that I don't regularly reread Melville's Anatomies. Instead, I urged my graduate students working on Melville to read it. And when I read their work, I feel I'm also to some extent reading or rereading Melville's Anatomies. All of which is to say, when I reread the entire book after over 20 years, I was surprised to see that it had 2 chapters on Pierre, and that in terms of pages and chapters, and I consulted with my son who does statistics, there was more on Pierre and related texts than on Melville's other works. I'd also forgotten that the book ends with Pierre. In that sense, we could say about Melville's Anatomies that all roads lead to Pierre. Sam says as much in the conclusion called Post-Mortem, when he writes, quote, "Thus in Pierre, Melville offers the ultimate scene of writing and reading in the series that began with the tattooed faces in Taipei." When we use the expression all roads lead to Rome, we mean that Rome is essentially the starting point, or let's say the defining reason for the journey. Could the same be said for Pierre in Melville's Anatomies? In my innocence, I had thought Taipei was the starting point, that an interest in tattoos led to an interest in skin in White Jacket, to an interest in the body in Moby Dick. But might Pierre have been the work that helped to inspire and shape the book? Is Pierre the key to it all? I don't have much time to explore this question. And I realize that Sam may pour cold water on my theory in his response. But I want to offer a few reflections on the 2 Pierre chapters as chapters that may have generated or helped to shape the other chapters. In his discussion of the picturesque in Pierre, Sam focuses on the eye and eventually the chest, the heart. One reads landscapes as Sam guides us through the first of his 2 chapters on Pierre, as one might read tattoos. We discover a history of saddle meadows in its surfaces. These surfaces suggest, in Gothic fashion, the centrality to New York's state of racial conflict, racial identity, and colonial dispossession, themes that are central to Sam's reading of Taipei and the novels that follow. In the subsequent chapter on Pierre, which focuses on inscribed hearts, Sam begins by stating that, quote, Melville's narrators had revealed themselves during the earlier books, yet self-exposure, graphic and devastating, is at the core of Pierre, end quote. Again, here's support for my theory that all roads lead to Pierre, or that it's Sam's engagement with Pierre that inspired the key themes of Melville's Anatomies. Self-revelation in extremis in Pierre, I posit, for example, led Sam to similar themes in the earlier works. Sam says as much when he states, again near the beginning of the second chapter on Pierre, that quote, "The quest for ultimate secrets launched in Typee and continued in White Jacket and Moby Dick, which sought its treasure in the figures and bodies of others, ends in Pierre with an intimate journey into the self," end quote. In Melville's Anatomies, Pierre is the telos, both the endpoint and, as is true for any telos, the starting point. In terms of telos, Sam writes near the end of this brilliant chapter, which reads Pierre as a sentimental text taken to the nth degree, that he reads Pierre in relation to other sentimental works of the time, with the idea that Pierre's confrontation with Enceladus is, quote, the culmination, and I'm adding that emphasis, the culmination of a series of recognitions that began with Tamu confronting the tattooed visages of the Marquesans in Typee, end quote. My brief reflections are meant to highlight something that I'd wager many of us have missed, the centrality of Pierre to Melville's Anatomies. I'm positing that it's the novel that initiated the project and Sam's creative imagination, and it doesn't matter if he disagrees with me. I just know that this is true. And I'm suggesting that it helps us to best understand what's at stake in Sam's great study. For what it's worth, the last word of Melville's Anatomies is Pierre. Need I say more? But I will. I want to conclude with one of my favorite passages from the book. It's about Pierre, and I'll offer no commentary, just the passage, which looks back to the earlier chapters and, better yet, provides an interpretive frame for those chapters and the overall book. Sam is commenting on the insights withheld from the character Pierre, and he writes as follows. Here is the central ideological recognition in Pierre. The geologist delves into the strata of rock. The archaeologist mines into the pyramid and lifts the lid on the sarcophagus. The narrator lays open Pierre, and they find an eloquent, layered emptiness. Although Pierre's heart lacks depth, its surface is belabored, crossed, and recrossed with lines of feeling. Pierre, the character, is presented as a victim of sentiments that Pierre, the novel, illuminates, but also perpetuates, resists, but also reinforces, understands, but cannot elude. And that's on page 250. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. Okay, well, thanks to all of you for these very insightful and I think both moving and witty papers, very much in keeping with the book itself that we're talking about. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the writer of the book itself, about which we've been speaking. Samuel Otter, our respondent and author of Melville's Anatomies, is the Clyde and Evelyn Slusser Chair of English Literature at the University of California at Berkeley. In addition to Melville's Anatomies, he is the author of Philadelphia Stories, where he examined narratives about race, character, manners, violence, and freedom in a range of works produced about Philadelphia and its free African-American communities between 1790 and 1860. He co-edited Frederick Douglass and Herman Melville, Essays in Relation with Bob Levine, from whom you've just heard, and Melville and Aesthetics with Jeffrey Sanborn. He was the editor of Leviathan from 2014 to 2019. And one of the great privileges of my career was to work with him on the journal during that time and especially on the 4 special issues that we published to celebrate the bicentennial of Melville's birth, Melville at 200. He has also served on the editorial boards of American Literature, ESQ, 19th Century Literature, PMLA, and Representations, and his essays have appeared in journals such as American Literature, American Literary History, Representations, and Raritan. Please welcome Sam Otter.
So the first thing to say is to thank you all so much for the talks, to thank Brian for conceiving of this panel and his hard work in making it possible. I'm honored and humbled by the attention paid to my first book. It's the kind of attention usually paid to people who are retiring, which I am not, or have expired, which I haven't. But I thought Cody made an excellent point in his presentation, my book aside, which is literary studies, literary critical efforts too often proceed merely by advance, in a sense that the road one is traveling, the path behind one evaporates or must be countered and eclipsed. So in my own teaching of graduate students, I am continually pressuring them to read scholarship, not just of the present, but of the past. And to my discombobulation, I must acknowledge that my first book is scholarship of the past. And I appreciate the thought and the generosity and the attention you've all given to it. It's so interesting to see the book reflected through this diverse set of eyes and critical perspectives and literary investments. And I think you never know your own work until you read reviews of it and talk with others about it. And I appreciate the insights and the clarifications you've brought to my own understanding of the work. I've just heard these papers for the first time, so I don't have a formal response. Before I say something more general about the responses, let me just specifically answer Bob Levine. And I smiled when you were talking, Bob, because you kept implying that I would disagree with you about Pierre being the telos, in some sense, not only the end, but the beginning, because however you gauge it, if you just gauge it autobiographically, indeed, the book began with essays on Pierre and with a dissertation on Melville, the only part of which that survived into Melville's Anatomies were the chapters on Pierre. So autobiographically, you're right. I appreciated your close reading of the book and all the signals I seem to have been giving without knowing it, that the beginning and the end of the book had its source in Pierre. So yes, it's a fascination with that book that brought me to do a Melville dissertation to try to figure out Pierre. It took 2 chapters to do it. There was some reluctance on the part of the publisher to have 2 Pierre chapters, but I insisted. So whether you measure it autobiographically or conceptually, you're right. You're unsettlingly accurate. Maybe the best thing for me to say before we open it up, and in some ways this will echo several of the things you've all said, is just to talk briefly about the ways in which I hope the book has or may have influenced literary scholarship on Melville and beyond in the years since it was published. And One would be questions of the body. And by that, I mean not only questions of racial representation, but I certainly mean that, since the typee, the white jacket, and the Moby Dick chapters of the book are essentially concerned with the ways in which meanings were invested in and extracted from human bodies, particularly in terms of race. And Wynn pointed to something I did have in mind in writing the book and continue to be drawn to in Melville, which is the difficulty of the prose and poetry, the queasy making of it, the discomfort as well as pleasure created by it, the ways in which as readers and as critics were continually caught short or tripped up or want the books to do something they don't, or want the career to take a different turn. So many readers, even a fair number of critics, seem to have wanted Melville to write prose and not turn to poetry. Many have found, if not a conservatism, at least a veering away from the more explicitly political in a later career. Again, in all sorts of ways, there's a difficulty that I've been fascinated with and tried to engage with. And in the first book, it had a great deal to do with questions of racial representation. So one way I hope the book has had an influence is in terms of analyses of the human body in terms of race, but also more broadly, and this was touched on in the responses as well, particularly by John Bryant, in terms of what's come to be considered a new range of materialisms that literary critics have been interested in. I was fascinated in the book with Melville's material interests in terms of the body, as John mentioned, but also in terms of the materiality of language. I was proud to be invited to write an afterword to a book edited by Meredith Farmer and Jonathan Schroeder called Ahab Unbound. It's coming out from Minnesota. I think it's scheduled to come out in December. And it was so interesting to me to write that afterward and to think about the ways in which Melville's Anatomies had, before it became an explicit concern of critics, or before it became a dominant concern, an interest in materiality. Another way I hope the book has had an influence has to do with authorship and the ways in which looking at a single author, sometimes reduced to an insularity or a provinciality, but I hope to demonstrate the ways in which looking at a single author was centrifugal. That is, and Brian touched on this, Cody as well, the ways in which to read Melville is to read the world that circulates through his prose. To read Melville is to see him enmeshed in his culture in ways that I've spent part of my career trying to track, but will never adequately fathom. We can see Melville enmeshed in his culture, but also the ways in which he distinctively maneuvers and rearticulates that culture. So I hope the book provides an example of how a focus on an author can bring the wider historical and critical world into that treatment. I don't, in the book, as several of you have mentioned, focus only on Melville. In fact, one of the original reviews complained that in terms of pages, there were too few pages on Melville in a book that had Melville in the title and too many pages on other things. But for me, those other things which several of you have cited, the historical debates, the range of literature, the nonfiction, is part of what makes Melville Melville. And then finally, and at the very beginning of his remarks, Brian touched on this, the sense that close reading is also deep and wide reading. That's probably my major continuing investment as a literary critic. A fascination with the details, a savoring of the difficulty and the pleasure and the disorientation and the sources and the challenges and the recalcitrance, the way Melville continually presses us to rethink what we think we know about the 19th century, about literature, about his own works. The making a case for the significance of the details that sometimes I think is lost in reductive and critiques of close reading, or the sense that we're beyond close reading, moving to a different kind of phase. I myself can't imagine being a literary critic without close textual attention. I certainly don't insist that that's what everyone does, but I think sometimes, as with what I said before about a critical tradition that dates back decades, sometimes we should, more than we do, connect the literary critical, the literary historical, the methodological past and present, rather than seeing it as a narrative of surmounting or supersession. I should end there so we can open it up. But again, it's an extraordinary honor to have all of you attend, and to have those of you who presented look back at my work and take it so seriously.
Thank you so much, Sam. Well, we have about 15 minutes remaining. The ALA actually has a strict limit of 1 hour and 20 minutes for these recordings. So I think by about 2:25 my time, which is going to be different for all of you, but 25 minutes after the hour, I'll have to stop the recording. If we do go on after that in terms of Q&A, we don't have to cut off the discussion immediately there, but I'll just let you know when I'm cutting things off for the sake of ALA's time guidelines. In terms of your questions, two good ways of doing this. One is if you want to use the raise hand function, or else just gesticulate wildly, we can, get our attention, and we can give you the opportunity to ask the question. You can also raise questions in the chat, which I'll try to monitor as well. So thanks so much again to Sam. Thanks so much to all of our panelists, and we'd love to hear from the rest of you. I see Kelly Ross has a question.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you so much to the whole panel for just absolutely lovely responses, and to Sam for that, beautiful response to the responses. It's really a wonderful occasion to be here, to be listening to everybody reflect on the way that Sam's work has inspired them, and it's inspired me as well, and I know so many of us. I wonder, Sam, if you were putting together an enlarged edition of the book, is there anything you would want to add to it at this point?
Thanks for the question, Kelley. And let me say first, which I meant to say before, that the way the squares are arranged on my screen, I'm in between Brian Yothers and John Bryant. so I'm the three Leviathan editors are visually together on the screen. John, the founding editor, I'm the next editor. Bryant is the current editor. Just since many of you are members of the Melville Society, just a shout out to the journal and its current editor and editorial staff. And I thought of that also when Kelley was talking, since she has a superb essay in Leviathan about temporality in Benito Cereno. So thank you for that question. And I think I'll answer it. Maybe I'll give you a local answer, Kelley, and then answer it in a different way by talking about a Melville book that I'm finishing. The local answer is, even as Mary Kay in her excellent talk was reading passages from my argument about Type, one always has, if not regret, second thoughts when one's prose becomes immutable. Having retaught Type many times since 1999 when the book was published, and even more years before that when the chapter was written, I think something I missed or didn't talk about sufficiently was the humor in Type. So one thing I would do if I were going to revise Melville's Anatomies, one should never revise books one has written. And also one would never get like promoted if all one did was revise books that one had written. But I'm still persuaded by the argument in the Type chapter, but I think the argument is missing a sense of how Melville's humor, which I think I take up more in subsequent chapters, plays a role. Or to put that another way, I think it seems too much in the chapter like the horror of tattooing is identically shared by the author and the narrator, which I don't think is the case. And that's partly where the humor comes in. So that's a local answer. Maybe a better way of answering Kelley's question is to say that I'm finishing a book called Melville's Forms, where after having written a second book that didn't have to do with Melville, although I did shoehorn 10 pages on Benito Cereno in a book called Philadelphia Stories. Again, the publisher was somewhat reluctant, but I insisted. But returning to Melville, I'm trying to do some things I didn't do before, look substantially at the poetry, that is, look at the longer career, not have the argument end with Pierre. Think about, as I implied before, how interesting and, again, in some ways recalcitrant Melville's career is. The turn to poetry, the turn away from the kind of explicit, vehement political engagement, or for some critics, a kind of progressive politics that's appreciated in the earlier prose. I look at the poetry, I look at the wider career. I try to both look at the arc of the entire career, but also mix things up. Not simply have a chronological march with generic contrast or distinctions between the prose and the poetry, but talk about the way in which the prose and the poetry often are engaged in similar kind of verbal experiments and intellectual projects. And then the final thing I'll say is I think, in a way that I've only realized as I'm finishing the book, what I try to do is go back to that phrase from the first book that Brian began with, how close reading can also be deep and wide reading. And I'm aiming to write a book that's about Melville, but also about the term form more widely in literary studies, a tiny pivotal term that there's been a resurgence of interest in, and think about literary form and think about the way, and even make a case for the value of the details and the value of that kind of verbal scrutiny. Form is often taken to mean structure. It's often treated as a given. I think for Melville, and the argument I make in the book, is that the term form is about a set of relationships that give it definition. Relationships between parts and wholes, between structure and duration, between insides and outsides, between word and image. I'm interested in how Melville might, as he did in the 1980s for historicist critics, Melville might in the 2020s be an interesting lens through which to think deeply and in new, or if not new, more precise ways about what we mean about form and what the value of that kind of verbal scrutiny might be. So I realize, Kelley, that in some ways I've evaded your question, but it's an evasion that comes from being immersed in a different kind of Melville book where my attention has been. And maybe in some ways that book would be, that book would be, the book I'm finishing would be itself an answer to your question about what might have been left out, what might be added.
Any other, John?
I think that was a great question, Kelley, and it certainly got a lot out, and from the deep wells of Sam's psyche, which I want to plunge even deeper into. As I was thinking about writing this presentation, I wanted first to try to look at what is very evident in Melville's Anatomies, and that is a kind of tension between the historicist and the aestheticist in you. And I put that in kind of biographical terms, I suppose. You know, sort of, there seems to be here a critic who seems deeply committed to both, and working out an accommodation, and I don't mean that in a negative way, an interpenetration of these two ways of looking. And I think, you know, in subsequent writings, including the book that you're working on form, really seems to be evolving into the aesthetic as a way of maybe re-legitimizing that particular approach without sacrificing the historical. And I was wondering how you, first of all, how you felt as you were writing Melville's Anatomies about this tension between the historicist and the aestheticist in you, if that's the right labels to use, and then how that is manifesting itself in your furthering of your career.
So thanks very much for the question, John. I think for me, tension, you asked me how I feel. I haven't felt, nor do I at present feel, a tension between the historicist and the formalist in me. That seemed to me sort of like it may just be having been in the profession for decades, but certain debates seem to me unproductive if they ever were. The choice between history and form, the choice between text and context. So what I've been interested in as a literary critic, certainly in that first book, is where the words, the diction, the syntax, the figures, where the scenes that writers play and replay in an unfolding dialogue, where those words and those figures and those scenes come from. So I take aesthetic pleasure, as I said more than once today. I'm also challenged by the difficulty of the articulations and by the recalcitrance of the literary text, which, if read carefully, doesn't simply submit to our wills as critics. But that pleasure, that fascination, that sense of difficulty has always been both aesthetic and historical for me. That is, where the words, the figures, the scenes come from is outside the words themselves. So I'm very interested in form, but I'm not a formalist in the, I'm not even sure it's accurate to call it the traditional sense. It's more a caricatured sense. There's a certain kind of formalist for whom biography or history is at odds with that interpretive project. But that isn't me. And I find the historical, in quotation mark, text that I read aesthetically often quite interesting. But I think you're right, just to wax autobiographical for a moment, I think you're right that in my own career, there's a, say in the first Melville book, there was an emphasis on both the historical and the formal, and maybe in a larger font would be the historical. In the Melville book I'm working on now, I'm still interested in the historical and the formal, but the larger font might be trying to think through what Melville meant by form and this series of vibrant tensions I described before between parts and wholes, inside and outside, structure and duration in Melville's works, but also try to make a larger methodological point and contribute to debates about form. So maybe the better way to answer your question, John, is to say, my interests as a literary critic are in history and in form. There probably has been and will be evident in the second Melville book compared to the first, a more self-conscious and explicit and sustained attention to the term form. But I've never, when I was a graduate student, I knew I was supposed to feel that tension. I was a graduate student at Cornell in the 1980s, and maybe a different way of answering your question, possibly to be insufferably autobiographical, is to say I was trained by a historicist, and I was trained by a historicist in an English department at a time when deconstruction reigned. As a graduate student, I was immersed in historicism that felt embattled in the time, although I didn't feel embattled, but also a sense of the sort of the literary philosophical attention to language and its resistances to interpretation. So I was probably molded, as we all, or many of us are, by that graduate training. But instead of feeling the separation or the tension, which many of my peers felt at the time, my literary interests were fueled by that those twin commitments.
Okay, so we have arrived at the end of our recording time. So I just want to invite anyone who wishes to give a round of applause to the panel. You know, you can unmute yourselves for a moment and we can applaud. And then I'll go ahead and shut off the recording. But if there are any last, questions or comments people have, we don't have to cut it off before you ask them. So thank you so much to everyone on this panel, and thank you to Sam.
Thank you all for coming.